Just kind of set the stage for you here. We talked last week about the idea that we just kind of sharing some thoughts that I think about every September, October as autumn rolls around, things that happen naturally in the cycle of the season that don't always fit into a sermon series. So last week we talked about the ideas that the leaves are changing and that they're turning these colors, and how that always reminds us a little bit of change and what change happens when we come to know Christ and that transformation that takes place in that relationship. And I think the other piece of fall is that it is the harvest season, right? That the corn's getting brought in and the wheat's getting chopped down. If you have a garden, you probably closed it up in the last 3 or 4 weeks and got everything taken care of. It is the season of the harvest. And long before anyone celebrated Halloween or anyone celebrated Thanksgiving, there were these festivals to celebrate the harvest. Having a time of celebration in the autumn was commonplace in nearly every ancient culture, because when you harvested, that meant you got to eat for the rest of the year, right? And eating is a good thing. And so it was a time of joy, a time of celebration, a time of laughter. And I thought we'd kind of replicate that a little bit this morning with a little bit of a season of joy. And by joy, I mean really bad jokes. So for example, do you know why we harvest in the fall and not the winter? Because in the winter, you'd have to use an ice sickle. A sickle made out of... I told you they were bad. What were you expecting, folks? Do you know how aliens harvest their crops? They use their tractor beam. No, not any better? How about this one? Do you know that when the farmer had a really bad harvest, he had a disease that spread all over his garden, and so he turned to a rap career? Because what else was he going to do with all those sick beets? No, not any better? All right, last one. What do you call it when someone gathers a whole bunch of really bad, cheesy jokes about the harvest? It's a cornucopia. A cornucopia, yeah? Or a bad sermon, one or the other. Now that we're in the right attitude and frame of mind this morning, you should know that Jesus used this image of the harvest repeatedly in his teaching. Sometimes in the context of a parable or a metaphor, sometimes in the context of direct teaching, sometimes in response to something someone had said or done to him. But frequently in the Gospels, we see Jesus connect this imagery of the harvest, of bringing in the harvest, and connecting it to the idea of salvation and evangelism and bringing souls into the kingdom. And so we're going to look at one of those passages this morning in Matthew chapter 9. If you want to turn there, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 9. And I think it's important to know kind of what's happening right before we get there. So while you turn, I'll let you know that the 3 stories immediately preceding this passage are Jesus going around and meeting people who are suffering and bringing healing into their life. There's the story of the woman who's been bleeding for years, and she touches Jesus, and all of a sudden she's made whole. And then there's the story of a couple of blind guys that Jesus meets, and when he's done with them, they can both see. And then there's the demon-possessed person, and Jesus casts the demon out of them. And so leading up to what we're about to read, Jesus has been traveling from town to town, place to place, and in the process, seeing people's hurt, seeing people suffering, having compassion upon them, and bringing wholeness to their broken lives. And that kind of sets the stage for this kind of, the end of all of these healings is what we get here at the end of Matthew chapter 9. We're going to start reading in verse 35 together. Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. It says, "Then Jesus went to all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every sickness." In other words, what we just saw him do at the beginning of Matthew 9, those stories, Jesus then continues to do, going from town to town, village to village, proclaiming the good news, calling people to repentance, and healing those who are sick, bringing wholeness into their broken lives. Verse 36, "And when he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them, because they were weary and worn out, like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. Therefore pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest.'" There are 3 things I want to talk about as we just kind of walk through this passage bit by bit. Jesus begins by saying, or Matthew begins by saying, Jesus saw the crowds and saw that they were weary and worn out like sheep without a shepherd. So the image here is not just a regular flock of sheep, This is a flock of sheep who are like scattered across the hillside. And they're lying down and their tongue's hanging out of their mouth and their eyes are kind of a little glossy, and you're like, man, something's wrong with that sheep. Yes, they are weary and worn out. That could come from any number of things. It could come from the fact that they've just been chased by some sort of predator and had to run away. When I have to run long distances, I lay down and my tongue hangs out of my mouth and my eyes get okay? You know the feeling, right? It could be that they haven't had enough to eat or drink, that they're living in some land where the ground is barren and they haven't been able to find good grass to graze on, or they haven't been able to find fresh water to drink for some time. It could be that the heat of the day has gotten to them, that it was one of those really hot, crazy days and the sun was out and they couldn't find any shade in the desert. And that's why Jesus says they're weary and worn out like a sheep without shepherd. Because whose job is it to make sure that the sheep is not attacked by predators? It's the shepherd's job. Whose job is it to make sure that the sheep have water and food to eat? It's the shepherd's job. Whose job is it to make sure they find shade in the heat of the day? That's the shepherd's job. And the only way these sheep get to this spot where they are overwhelmed, where they're worn out, where they can't go on anymore, is if they are sheep without a good shepherd. And I think that's important because it says Jesus had compassion on them. His heart was broken for them because he knew that the problem was not that they didn't have water. The problem was not that they'd been chased by a predator. The problem was they didn't have a shepherd. And so he sees her brokenness, and instead of judging them or condemning them or pointing things out to them, he simply introduces them to the good shepherd. And I think that's so instructive for us because as we move into this idea of what it's like to share the gospel, to be a worker, to bring in the harvest, it begins with compassion. Most of the people that you meet who don't know Christ probably annoy you, right? They probably have habits you don't approve of. They probably dress in a way you don't like, or they're angry all the time, or they're selfish, or they're living a lifestyle you don't approve of. There's reasons that you don't talk to those people. And what I want you to know is that when Jesus saw people, he did not see their sin. He did not see their bad habits. He saw that they were broken because they didn't have a shepherd. And he had compassion on them. And those people that you meet in your life, that you work with, that swear like a sailor or drink way too much or living in whatever way you find offensive, they don't need your judgment. They don't need your condemnation. They don't need you to point fingers and tell them how bad they are. They need a shepherd. And our task is to introduce them to the good shepherd, the one who can heal what is broken, the one who can fix what is wrong in them, the one who can bring wholeness into their life. And this motivation for sharing the gospel begins with compassion. I see you're hurting. I see you're weary. I see you're worn out. I see you're overwhelmed. I see you're unhappy. I see you're depressed. I see you're anxious. Let me introduce you to the one who can help. And so the first thing we notice is Jesus' compassion for these folks in the crowd. The second thing you should notice is he says the harvest is plentiful or abundant. I can only think of this in terms of we've had a garden in our family for about 10 years now. We actually share a garden with some good friends of ours. When we lived in Canal Fulton and we started the garden, we had a house that was entirely on a hill that had 5 massive shade trees, and there was literally nowhere vegetables would grow anywhere on the property. And they had just bought a new home and had a nice big flat sunny area in the backyard. And so we put in a 16-foot by 32-foot, it's a pretty good sized garden that between the two families we share. And there are some years where the harvest is enough. You know, we go pick green beans and like once a week you'll get fresh green beans for dinner. Our family will get a batch, they'll get a batch. It'll feed each family one time a week. We did something a little different this year. For the first time in several years, we added, let's call it organic bovine fertilizer, okay? Raised right here in Tusk County, okay? We've got some friends who live just down the street from us. They have a single cow. We said, hey, would you clean out your stall and put some of it in the bed of my pickup truck? By the way, one of my favorite parenting story ever. If you want to hear it, ask me after service. Dad win 1,000,000 times over. But we hauled it in my pickup truck up the interstate, took it in the garden, tilled it in the garden. The harvest was abundant this year. I'm telling you, my counter in my kitchen has looked like this since the middle of July. Like we would get done processing, freezing, canning, giving away, eating. Like finally we got through everything. We've made the zucchini bread to freeze and we've given 6 away. And then Candace would go, hey, I stopped by the garden on my way home from school today. And there's another bag. We picked 42 tomatoes 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. Okay, we've been doing that every week since July. Okay, the harvest was abundant. And what I think is important for us to know here is Jesus says when it comes to people who are broken, when it comes to people who are hurting, when it comes to people who need to hear the gospel, the harvest is abundant. Our churches are surrounded by people who need the gospel. And if the church is not growing, it's not because there aren't people who need the gospel message. It's not because there aren't people wrestling with shame and guilt. It's not because there aren't people who are wrestling with self-image and self-worth. They are all around you every moment of every day. You are surrounded by people who need what you have. And if there aren't new bodies flooding into churches across our country, it's not because we become too liberal. It's not because of who we put in office. It's not for any of those reasons. It's because the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. There are plenty of folks who need to hear the message. But there aren't just enough people who care to tell them. And that's where the problem is. Let me illustrate it for you this way. I brought with me today a shovel. Shovels are good for lots of things. They're good for digging holes in the ground, good for spreading gravel, spreading mulch. You can even use them to scoop bovine fertilizer if you'd like. Though I recommend a pitchfork, it's a little more efficient. You can do it with a shovel if push comes to shove. Don't get shoved in the fertilizer. That's the general rule. But I would say there's another use that I've seen shovels used for almost as much as anything else. On nearly every work site I've ever been on, whether we're having a church work day or I'm helping somebody build a deck at their house or we're fixing the fence at Grandpa's, every work site I've ever been on has at least one shovel leaner. You know that guy? The guy who shows up and has no intention of breaking a sweat, no intention of lifting anything heavy, but he's going to pick up that shovel and he's going to lean on it like this, and he sure is going to tell everybody else what they're doing wrong, and he sure is going to grumble and complain when things aren't up to code, and he doesn't mind sharing his opinion, but he's not actually going to do any of the work. It has been my experience that churches are full of shovel leaners. Churches are full of people who want to point out everything that's being done wrong. The building wasn't neat enough or clean enough. The lights weren't changed. That program was kind of boring. Didn't advertise well enough. The sermon wasn't really interesting to me. You didn't sing the songs that I like. They've never done anything for the kingdom. They've never shared the gospel with anybody. They've never shown up on a service day. They've never taught a class. They've never led worship. They haven't done anything. They're just leaning on a shovel, telling everybody else what they ought to do. If Jesus' words in Matthew 9 are to be believed, the harvest is plentiful. There are lots of people who need to hear the gospel, and there is no place for a shovel leaner in the kingdom. There simply aren't enough workers for you to be standing around telling everybody else what they ought to do. Your job is to be one of the workers who goes and collects the harvest. I'll give you an example. It's a little bit of bragging and hopefully a lot of celebration. I had the opportunity about 3 weeks ago to be a guest on we'll call it semi-national podcast. This guy, a friend of mine named Dale Sellers, hosts a podcast for the 95 Network. He helps small churches all around the country. About 1,500, 2,000 people listen to an episode, so we'll call it semi-national, right? And he invited me on because you've heard me talk about the training we've done, that Drew and I have done for like digital discipleship, how to use technology to try to reach people who aren't in our building. And we've taken these courses through his program. And part of the reason he asked me to be a guest is because they have these people who come on and take the classes. Okay, they pay the money, they sit down, they go through 4 hours or 9 hours of training, and they get all the tools and they learn how to do all the stuff, and then they don't do anything with it. Like they've taken the class, they've been taught how to do it, and 6 months later they're like, well, nothing's changed, which has probably been your experience with a lot of things in life, that people try things like, oh, I would really love to, and then they don't ever actually change anything about their life. And Drew and I think partially because we're just both idiots who jump into everything with both feet all the time. We are both jump first, look second kind of people. Or just like, all right, we're going to run with this. We're going to do this, and if it's not good, then we'll figure it out and we'll make it better. And we're just going to jump in with both feet. And the bragging / celebrating part is, you should know that in the month of October, over 11,000 people have seen those videos that we produce. Over 11,000 people have heard little 90-second to 3-minute clips of Drew and I sharing the gospel. And he asked me, he goes, why do you think it's different for you? Why did you guys just run with this and do this? And this is the answer I gave him. I said, because I actually believe this gospel stuff is true. I actually believe living in my town right now are people going through nasty divorces, who are hurting, who their self-worth is all messed up because their ex-spouse has said terrible things about them, and they feel like somehow they're not good enough. And I actually believe that if they could just hear Jesus whisper, I love you so much. You are so precious to me. I died because I love you. You are worth so much. I actually believe it'll change their lives. I actually believe that there are people living in our community right now who are struggling with grief, who have just lost their kids or lost their spouse or lost their parent, who are overwhelmed with this depression that comes with that they don't know which way is up. And I actually believe that the gospel has a message of hope that will help them find their way to the other side of that. I actually believe that there are people wrestling with fear and anxiety because they don't like the way our country's going, or they don't like the medical diagnosis they got, or they're struggling financially and they don't know if they're going to make it. And I believe that when you proclaim the truth of a God who's in charge of everything, who is good and great, that there is hope in that can change their lives. And if I believe that, then how can I lean on a shovel? If I believe that I have the solution to what is broken in their hearts, how can I not tell them? And so you give me a tool that allows me to speak to 11,000 people in a month, and I'm going to pick it up and do it. Why wouldn't I? And yet, many of us don't. Right? We have our list of excuses. I don't know enough. I'm really busy. I'll probably just mess it up. They'll reject me. They don't want to hear what I have to say anyway. Or my favorite, I don't know anyone who's not a Christian. Well, that's a problem. Seriously, that's a problem. Go into all the world, live such good lives among the pagans. That's a problem. If you really believe this stuff, if you really believe that Jesus is the answer to so many of the questions our culture is asking, then what's your excuse for not sharing it? And I don't mean getting a bullhorn on the street corner and screaming at people. I mean, what's your excuse for not talking to your neighbor? What's your excuse for not talking to your coworker? What's your excuse? Here's where I am. As much as it depends on me, if someone comes to the end of their life and they don't know who Jesus is, I don't want it to be my fault. I want to be able to look my God in the face and say, I did everything I could to tell as many people as I could about the hope and healing that's found in Jesus. From a stage in a church, to a screen in my house, to the conversations at the coffee shop, to phone calls while I'm driving down the road, I did everything in my power to make sure they knew. They still got to make a choice. They still got to respond. But I don't want it to be my fault because I was lazy, because I was busy, because I was worried what they would think, because I didn't feel like I was good enough. I want to proclaim the great God and what he can do for their lives. And if we could learn to do that as the people of God, bit by bit, life by life, we could make a real difference. We could watch the kingdom grow. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't happen overnight. You know, we read these stories in the book of Acts about thousands of people being baptized in a day. That'd be awesome, don't get me wrong. But my experience has been it tends to happen one life at a time, one person at a time, one response at a time. And when you do that, it's amazing what happens.
This is Nate. Nate became a Christ follower 2 weeks ago and is still a bit giddy about it. Now he's trying not to do cartwheels in public. Nate became a believer partly because of Kim. Yet oddly enough, Kim and Nate have never met. How is this possible? Well, let's take a look. Kim loved Jesus from an early age, and in college she had a huge impact on her friends. While most of her peers used their college years to, well, experiment, Kim didn't. She remained committed to her faith, and it showed. It especially showed to Lisa, her roommate, who confessed to Kim that she wanted whatever it was that made Kim so strong. Kim shared her faith with Lisa, and Lisa believed. Years later, at Lisa's first real job, she met Thomas. Thomas was hit by a drunk driver when he was 13 and still carried a lot of anger and bitterness. Thomas and Lisa became friends, and it wasn't long before he started going to church with Lisa and her husband. After a lot of studying and searching, Thomas gave his life to Christ. Fast forward a few years. Thomas became a public speaker and was often asked to speak at large events. See, when he became a believer, Thomas developed a new perspective on life. He stopped resenting what had been taken from him and started being thankful for the second chance he had been given. On one particular day, Thomas shared about overcoming hardship and what it means to choose joy. He was so passionate that a number of people were inspired to share a link to his video. The video of Thomas inspired James, too. And if anyone needed inspiration, it was him. James had a ton of issues. He spent most of his life as a passive husband, an absent father, and a horrible friend. That said, no one disliked him more than he disliked himself. But everything changed the night he happened to watch Thomas online. Something clicked and he knew what he had to do. He surrendered his miserable life to someone greater, and he was forever changed. James fought hard to make up for the lost years with his family, and he also began working with young men who were in danger of throwing their lives away. One of those men was Nate. Nate didn't really know his own dad, and he had no real direction in life, ultimately bouncing from one bad decision to another. Because of that, he often found himself in trouble with the law. No one had ever showed him what it looked like to be a real man. That is, until he met James. James became the first father figure Nate ever had. He learned about honesty, self-control, humility, and integrity, and where those traits come from. 2 months later, Nate publicly declared his belief in Christ, and of course, James was there. Now you can see the connection. Nate was impacted by James, who was influenced by Thomas. Thomas saw an uncommon joy in Lisa, who learned of Jesus from Kim. Kim's relationship with God eventually led to Nate's. Funny how these two people have never met and never will.
I know I've shared at length kind of what my family story looks like, and I'll just give you the thumbnail sketch again, but if at any point you've ever been impacted by anything I've done here, or for that matter, Drew's done here, because he's part of kind of my own tree, you owe that to a couple of old ladies from Guy and Dot Christian Church in Huntington, West Virginia. My grandparents were about as far from God as you can get. They spent a lot of time in the bar and not very much inside of a church. And when my uncle got sick, a couple of ladies brought cookies and sat with my grandmother in the hospital for days on end while her little baby was sick and led her to Christ. And then she brought my grandfather to the church with those famous words. She wanted to start tithing, and she told my grandfather, I'm taking your kids and your money to that church. If you want to see either one, you can come with me. Talk about a strong woman. When my grandfather became a Christian, he decided to spend the next 40 years of his life preaching the gospel in churches, and went to Kentucky Christian College when he was 35 years old. Raised his kids, who raised their kids, who are now raising their kids to know and follow Christ. There are literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in this world who now know Jesus and about Jesus because a couple of old ladies in Huntington, West Virginia sat with my grandmother and showed her the love of Jesus Christ. This is not about getting on a stage and changing the world. It's about finding that one person in your life that you can be the love of Christ for. It's about finding that one person in your life that you can serve, that you can love, that you can speak the truth to, that you can invite to come to know what you have found, and then watching what God does with that one and finding another one. You can do this. We can do this if we put the shovels down and we get to work. And so we're going to watch that second video now in just a second, and we're going to use that as our invitation time. And as it plays, I'm going to challenge you to do this and this alone. To write down the name of just one person. Who is in your life right now who needs what you have found? Who is in your life right now that needs the hope and the peace and the joy that you have found in Christ? And I'm going to ask you to pray for that person while this song plays. That God would give you the courage and the skill and the opportunity to speak truth into that person's life. That you would become a worker for the kingdom. The harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. And so I'm going to pray that God would send workers. That God would challenge you to become one of his workers, to go into your workplace, your community, your family, and to begin to reach that one and to see what God does with your faithfulness. And so I'm going to ask you to pull out your bulletin, pull out a note card, type it on a text on your phone, but while this plays, to think about who is your one, and are you willing to become a worker for the kingdom? So let's watch and let this be our prayer as we wrap up service today.
If it's bandaging the broken, or washing filthy feet, here I am, Lord, send me. If it's loving one another, even when we don't agree, here I am, Lord, send me. If I'm poor, if I'm wealthy, I'll serve you just the same. Here I am, Lord, send me. On the mountain or the valley, I will choose to praise. Here I am, Lord, send me. If I'm known by how I love, let my life reflect how much I love you. I love you. And before you even ask, oh, my answer will be yes, 'cause I love you. I love you. If the truth cuts like an arrow, I will say it anyway. 'Cause here I am, Lord, send me. And if it means that they'll reject me, Lord, I will still obey. 'Cause here I am, Lord, send me. And if I'm known by how I love, let my life reflect how much I love you. I love you. And before you even ask, oh, my answer will be yes, 'cause I love you. Oh, I love you. When I'm standing in your glory, I'll be glad I chose to say, here I am, Lord, send me.
I want to finish with a prayer today. The words that we just listened to, he says, send to me. That comes directly out of Isaiah 6. And I always love that story because Isaiah catches a glimpse of who God is. And then once he realizes how great God is, he's like, whatever you need, God, I'm going. And so I'm going to pray for you that you would catch a glimpse of how great God is, of how majestic his love is, and that you would repeat his words. God, I want to go do whatever you want me to do because I believe you are the only one worth serving and following. I love the way that we cut off there, the last verse, but that last line, that when it comes to the end of time, when it comes to the day of glory, never once will I regret saying, send me. What a beautiful image for us to leave on this morning. Father, I pray for each of us that we would be reminded of what it is we do here. When we gather in this building, it's not just habit or routine. It's not just a check-in. We come because you are glorious. You are holy and majestic and powerful. You are creator of all things. You are good and righteous, and you love us. And your grace has redeemed us. And you have made us whole. Who can imagine where we would be if not for your goodness and your grace? God, paint that picture on our hearts and in our minds that we may live in recognition of all you have done for us and all you can do for those around us. And may we, like Isaiah, respond, here we are, God. Send us. To the lost, send us. To the hurting, send us. To the broken, send us. To the rebellious, send us. God, let us go with your message. For the harvest is abundant. Let us be the workers who do the work. God, we love you. We thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks so much for coming. Have a great week, everybody.